Imagine a king, not a fairy tale king in a gilded castle, but a man of flesh, blood, and iron will. A man who has spent more than 60 years on a throne. A lifetime locked in a death struggle with the greatest superpower the world had ever known. Now, picture him in his final moments. He isn't on a battlefield, sword in hand. He isn't in his palace, surrounded by fawning courtiers. He is trapped, cornered in a citadel. The cold stones of his fortress, a final, unyielding cage. Outside the walls, he doesn't hear the adoring chants of his people. He hears the roar of an army. But it is not the army of his lifelong enemy. It is his own. His soldiers, his commanders, the men he had led for decades, have turned against him, and leading them, the ultimate betrayal, his own son. The king knows there is no escape. The enemy he could never vanquish, the Roman Republic, will finally have him. He imagines the humiliation, being dragged through the streets of Rome in chains. A living trophy for a triumphant general. His legendary defiance reduced to a public spectacle. For this king, such a fate is infinitely worse than death. So, he makes a choice. A choice he has been preparing for his entire life. He summons his 2 daughters, who have remained loyal. Together, they will cheat their enemies of their prize. The king produces a vial, poison, but this is no ordinary poison, and he is no ordinary man. This is Mithridates VI of Pontus, the Poison King, and for his entire adult life, he has been meticulously, systematically ingesting a cocktail of sublethal doses of every known toxin. He has waged a war not only against Rome, but against nature itself, building a fortress of immunity within his own veins. His daughters drink the poison, and it is swift. They collapse and die at his feet. Now it is his turn. He drains the vial, the familiar acrid taste, a final, grim communion with his own dark science. He waits for the convulsions, for the darkness, to claim him, but nothing happens. The shouts of the rebel army grow louder. The pounding on the gates intensifies. Still, he stands. His heart beats strong. His breath is steady. In a moment of horrifying irony, the king realizes his life's greatest work. His shield against assassination has become his prison. The very thing he perfected to preserve his life now denies him the right to end it. His own body has betrayed him, refusing to grant him the mercy of a quick death. He is a master of poisons, yet immune to their final gift. Panic, for the first time, must have gripped this man of iron. He tries to stab himself with his sword, but his hands, weakened by age and despair, can only inflict a clumsy non-fatal wound. He is trapped by his son outside, and trapped by his own impregnable biology within. It is in this moment of ultimate desperation that he sees a loyal bodyguard, a Gaul named The king stumbles towards him, his royal robes stained with his own blood, and he makes one final command. He does not beg for his life, he begs for his death. He demands that this soldier, this loyal servant, do what the might of Rome and the power of poison could not. He commands his own horrific execution. Why? Why would a king, a man who had defied an empire, who had built a legend of invincibility, reach such a point of utter desperation? What kind of life leads a man to demand a sword in his own heart as a final, desperate act of freedom? 2. Understand this final, brutal command. We must unravel the life of the man who gave it. A life of such paranoia, violence, and relentless ambition that it makes him one of the most terrifying and fascinating figures in all of history. Our story doesn't begin with his death in that cold citadel in 63 BC, it begins decades earlier, in a kingdom on the shores of the Black Sea, with the murder of a father and the terror of a young boy. Mithridates was born into a world of violent intrigue. The kingdom of Pontus, in modern-day Turkey, was a powerful Hellenistic state, a fusion of Greek and Persian culture, but it lived under the ever-lengthening shadow of Rome. The Roman Republic was a machine of conquest, relentlessly expanding eastward, swallowing kingdoms whole through war, diplomacy, and subversion. To be a king in this era was to be a player in a deadly game, where the price of losing was not just your crown, but your life and your entire dynasty. Around the year 120 BC, when Mithridates was just a boy of about 14, his father, Mithridates V, was assassinated at a lavish banquet in his own palace, poisoned. The culprit was almost certainly someone within his own inner circle, a conspiracy, likely involving his own wife and Mithridates' mother, Mithridates VI. Suddenly, the world of the young prince was shattered. The halls of the palace, once a place of security, were now filled with whispers and menacing shadows. His own mother, now ruling as regent, seemed to favor his younger brother. To the young Mithridates it was clear, he was next. This was the crucible that forged him. It was here that the seeds of his lifelong paranoia were sown. He could trust no one, not his advisors, not his generals, not even his own family. Every cup could hold poison. Every friendly word could hide a dagger. And so, he did something extraordinary. He fled. He disappeared from the court, abandoning the trappings of royalty for a life on the run in the rugged wilderness of Anatolia. For 7 years, Mithridates lived as a fugitive in his own kingdom. Imagine this, a boy raised in luxury, now sleeping on the cold earth, hunting his own food, constantly moving to avoid his mother's assassins. This period of his life is shrouded in legend, but the truth it reveals is profound. He hardened himself, both physically and mentally. He grew tall and powerful, renowned for his physical strength and his ability to outride and outhunt any of his companions. He learned the languages of the diverse tribes under his future rule, a skill that would later allow him to command his vast multi-ethnic armies without interpreters. But most importantly, it was during this self-imposed exile that his obsession with poison began. He understood that poison had killed his father and that it was the most likely weapon to be used against him, so he decided to master it, to conquer it. He began a systematic study of toxicology, a dark and dangerous science. He sought out physicians and root cutters, learning the properties of every venomous creature and toxic plant, and he began to experiment on himself. This is the origin of the term we still use today, Mithridatism, the practice of protecting oneself against a poison by gradually self-administering non-lethal amounts. It was a slow, deliberate poisoning of the self, a biological arms race waged within his own veins. Day after day, he would consume a tiny amount of arsenic, a drop of snake venom, a pinch of belladonna. Gradually increasing the dosage, he combined dozens of these toxins into a daily concoction, a secret formula that would become legendary, the antidotum Mithridaticum. He was not just building a kingdom, he was building an immunity. He was making his own body an impregnable fortress, a reflection of the fortress he would need to build around his kingdom to defy Rome. When he finally returned from the wilderness, he was no longer a frightened boy. He was a hardened man, physically imposing, cunning, and pathologically suspicious of everyone. He marched into the capital city of Sinope and seized the throne. His mother and younger brother were promptly thrown into prison, where they soon died, whether by starvation or direct order. Their fate sent a clear message. Mithridates VI was now in absolute control, and he would eliminate any threat, real or perceived, without hesitation. With Pontus secured, Mithridates began to look outward. He saw a world of weak kingdoms and, on the horizon, the ever-approaching eagle standards of the Roman legions. But he didn't see Rome as an unstoppable force. He saw it as a corrupt, avaricious bully, a mad dog, as he would later call it, feasting on the decaying Hellenistic world. And he, Mithridates, Eupator Dionysus, saw himself as the savior, the great champion of the East who would drive the Latin wolves back into the sea. This wasn't just about power, it was an ideological war. Mithridates presented himself as a liberator, a new Alexander the Great, who would free the Greek cities of Asia Minor from the crushing weight of Roman taxation and governance. And for many, the Romans were indeed oppressive masters. Their publicans, the tax collectors, were notoriously predatory, bleeding the provinces dry and driving people into debt slavery. Mithridates' message of liberation found fertile ground. For years, he built his power, annexing neighboring territories, forging alliances, and building a massive army and navy. Rome, distracted by internal conflicts like the Social War and the rise of generals like Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla, watched with growing unease, but did little to stop him. Mithridates saw his moment. He knew that a direct confrontation was inevitable, and he decided to strike first with an act of such calculated, shocking brutality that it would echo through history, an act that would make him the eternal and unforgivable enemy of the Roman people. In 88 BC, he orchestrated what is now known as the Asiatic Vespers. He sent secret letters to the governors of all the major cities under his control in Asia Minor. The instructions were precise and horrific. On a single, designated day, his soldiers and deputized citizens were to turn on and kill every single Roman and Italian man, woman, and child within their borders. The scale of the slaughter is difficult to comprehend. Ancient sources, like the historian Appian, claim that 80,000 people were massacred in a single day. Some modern historians argue the number might be an exaggeration, but the reality was undeniably a genocide. These were not soldiers killed in battle. They were civilians, merchants, administrators, moneylenders, their wives, their children, their slaves. They were dragged from their homes and businesses. Those who fled to the sacred temples for asylum, places that were supposed to be inviolable sanctuaries, were cut down at the altars. The goddess Artemis at Ephesus, a deity revered for centuries, could offer no protection. The killers were promised a share of their victims' property, turning an act of political violence into a frenzy of personal greed. This was not a spontaneous riot. It was a cold, calculated act of state-sponsored terrorism on an industrial scale. For Mithridates, it was a masterstroke. With one bloody act, he had wiped out the Roman presence in the region and bound the local populations to his cause through their complicity in the crime. There could be no turning back. They had slaughtered Rome's children. Now they had to fight or face Rome's vengeance. For Rome, this was their 9/11s. It was an unforgivable atrocity that demanded not just defeat, but annihilation. The name Myth became synonymous with barbarism. The war was no longer about territory or influence. It was about revenge. And so began the First Mithridatic War. Rome dispatched one of its most formidable generals, Sulla, to deal with the Pontic king. Mithridates, emboldened by his success, had invaded Greece, where he was initially welcomed by cities like Athens as a liberator, but the dream of liberation soon soured under the reality of his rule. The Roman war machine, though internally divided, was brutally efficient. Sulla besieged and sacked Athens, and then crushed Mithridates' armies in 2 decisive battles. Defeated, but not broken, Mithridates fled back to Asia, and here, we see the pattern that would define his entire life: incredible resilience. Any other king would have been finished. His armies were shattered, his navy destroyed, his reputation as an invincible liberator in tatters, but Mithridates was a survivor. He negotiated a peace treaty with Sulla, who was eager to return to Rome to deal with his own political enemies. The terms were harsh, but they left Mithridates on his throne. For Rome, it was a temporary truce. For Mithridates, it was a brief respite to rebuild. This is one of the most astonishing aspects of his career. Rome would knock him down, scatter his forces, and strip him of his conquests. And every single time, like a phantom of the East, he would rise again. He would retreat into the vast, rugged interior of his kingdom, raise new armies from Scythian horsemen and tribal warriors, find new sources of wealth, and prepare for the next round. He waged 3 separate, massive wars against Rome over a period of nearly 30 years. He faced a succession of Rome's greatest generals: Sulla, the ruthless political genius; Lucullus, the brilliant tactician; and finally, the man who would end it all, Pompey, the Great. But as the decades of unending warfare ground on, the character of Mithridates began to curdle. The paranoia that had been born in his youth, the fear of the poisoned cup, metastasized into a full-blown pathology of tyranny. An empire built on fear must be maintained by fear. He saw assassins in every shadow and traitors in every corner of his court, and his solution was always the same: extermination. He became a monster to his own family. He executed several of his sons. He had his own sister wife, Laodicea, same name as his mother, a grim echo of his past, murdered on suspicion of infidelity. When his armies faced defeat, he would send eunuchs to his harem with orders to kill all his wives and concubines, not out of malice, but so they would not fall into Roman hands. It was a possessiveness so absolute that he preferred them dead than to be touched by his enemies. His most loyal generals and advisors were not safe. One commander, after losing a battle, chose to surrender to the Romans rather than face the wrath of his king. The paranoia consumed him, turning him from a champion of Hellenism into a paranoid butcher. The man who had once inspired hope in the Greek cities now ruled through terror. He was locked in a 2-front war, against the legions of Rome without, and against the phantoms of betrayal within. The final war, against Pompey the Great, was the end of the line. Pompey was a different kind of adversary. He was methodical, relentless, and had been granted unprecedented resources and authority by the Roman Senate. He systematically dismantled Mithridates' network of alliances, and then, in a decisive night battle in 66 BC, he annihilated the Pontic army. Once again, Mithridates escaped. It was what he did best. With a handful of followers, he undertook an epic journey, a desperate flight that showcased his legendary stamina. He retreated to Colchis, the land of the Golden Fleece, and then made an almost unbelievable trek around the entire Black Sea, through savage tribal lands, finally reaching the northernmost edge of his realm, the Bosporan Kingdom, in modern-day Crimea. He was now an old man, nearly 70 years old. He had lost his kingdom, his armies, his family, but his will remained unbroken. Even now, from this remote frozen outpost, he began planning one last, impossibly audacious campaign. His plan was to gather the fierce Scythian and Celtic tribes of the Danube and invade Italy itself, to bring the war to Rome's doorstep, a mad echo of Hannibal's campaign centuries earlier. But it was a fantasy. His soldiers, who had followed him through deserts and mountains, across decades of war and bloodshed, had finally reached their limit. They were exhausted, they were homesick. They saw no end to the fighting, only a mad, suicidal quest led by an old man who could not accept defeat. The loyalty that Mithridates had commanded for so long finally fractured, and the catalyst for the final break was the one person he should have been able to trust: his favorite son and chosen heir, Pharnaces. Pharnaces saw the writing on the wall. He knew his father's plan was insane. He saw a chance to save himself and what was left of the kingdom by cutting a deal with the Romans. He chose pragmatism over loyalty. He chose survival over his father's suicidal pride. He raised the banner of rebellion, and the weary army, seeing a chance for peace, flocked to him. This was the final blow. This was the betrayal from which there was no recovery. It wasn't the legions of Rome that had finally cornered him. It wasn't the brilliance of Pompey the Great. It was his own child, the son he had groomed to continue. His legacy had become his executioner. The roar that Mithridates heard outside his citadel in the city of Pantikapaean was the sound of his own legacy turning on him. And so we return to that cold, stone room. We see the old king, his world crumbling around him, his daughters dead at his feet, and we see the poison failing. The ultimate, cruelest irony, the shield he had spent a lifetime perfecting, the art of poison that defined his legend, had become his final cage. His body, so disciplined and hardened against death, now refused to obey his command to die. He was trapped between the son who wanted him captured and the body that refused to let him go. Think of the psychological agony of that moment. His entire life had been a testament to his will, his ability to control his destiny, to defy the odds, to survive. Now, in the final moment, he had no control. This is why he turns to the Gallic soldier Mithridates. This is why he demands the sword. It wasn't just a request for suicide. It was a final, desperate act of agency. If he could not control his life, he would, by the gods, control the circumstances. Of his death, he would not be paraded in Pompey's triumph. The Roman crowds would be denied the spectacle of seeing the great Mithridates, the terror of the East, humbled and in chains. His name would not be a footnote in the story of Pompey's glory. By demanding that his own man kill him, he was scripting his final scene. He chose the death of a warrior king, slain by a loyal hand, rather than the fate of a captive. It was his last act of defiance, an act that said, "You, Rome, will not have me, my son. You will not hand me over. I, and I alone, will decide when and how my story ends." The sword of Mithridates was not just a weapon. It was the instrument of his final, furious assertion of will. It was a horrific execution, but in his mind, it was also his final bloody victory. When news of his death reached the Roman camp, Pompey reportedly was overjoyed. He had finally vanquished the enemy who had haunted Rome for a generation. But when he saw the body of the old king, he is said to have shown a moment of respect. For his fallen adversary, he ordered a royal burial. He understood that he had defeated not just a man, but a force of nature. What, then, is the legacy of Mithridates? Was he a freedom fighter, a noble champion standing against the tyranny of Roman imperialism? Or was he a genocidal monster, a paranoid tyrant who murdered his own family and led his people through decades of ruinous, pointless warfare? The truth, as it so often is that he was both. He represents the profound tragedy of a man consumed by his own righteous crusade. His hatred of Rome was not unfounded. His desire to protect his kingdom was understandable. But that righteous anger, filtered through the lens of absolute power and deep-seated paranoia, twisted him into the very thing he claimed to be fighting against. He became a tyrant to save his people from tyranny. He committed mass murder in the name of liberation. His story is a chilling lesson in the corrupting nature of power and the toxic cycle of vengeance. It shows us how a lifelong obsession, even a noble one, can curdle into a destructive mania. Mithridates couldn't stop the war became his identity. Defiance became his reason for being. And in the end, when there was nothing left to fight for and nowhere left to run, his greatest fear was not death. It was irrelevance. It was the humiliation of being captured, of being made a pawn in someone else's story. And so he chose a death that was as violent, dramatic, and self-directed as his life had been. He demanded his own horrific execution, because, in a life defined by the struggle for control, it was the only control he had left.